Tarrant County Master Gardener Association has partnered with the Tarrant Regional Water District to encourage water conservation. TRWD maintains 4 area lakes and pipelines needed to provide surface water to local water treatment plants so they can clean that water to meet drinking standards for our communities. There are currently 2.3 million people living in Tarrant County, and this is expected to double over the next 50 years. At SaveTarrantWater.com, you can sign up for free weekly watering advice custom to your location. There's also an event calendar where you can find information about future classes and workshops. So be sure and check out SaveTarrantWater.com to sign up for their free services.
All right, the next plant we're going to tackle is Salvia greggii. This is a shrubby perennial, but the key to keeping this plant compact and bushy and blooming well is to trim it extremely hard in February. So it will grow to be about 2.5 to 3 feet wide, but every February we're going to cut it down to 6 inches tall. So you can use these shears. You can use mechanical hedge trimmers because it doesn't need to be pretty. You can just chop it off. If any of the stems are too big to cut for the shears to cut through, you can use loppers or hand pruners. So all I do is come in here and chop it off. And the pruning police aren't going to come and measure 6 inches. Somewhere between 1 foot and 6 inches is good, just to get all that old growth off. If you don't do this, the plant tends to get very woody and rangy, and sometimes it can split in the middle and then it just doesn't bloom as well. So if you'll do this every February, this is one of my favorite perennials, and it just performs amazing when you do that. Okay, so we're gonna do the next one. Same way. And there you go. Awesome. So now we're going to talk about perennials, and the first one I'm going to show you is, this is Katie's Ruellia, or dwarf Mexican petunia. I have one interesting way to prune it. When it's really dry and crispy in the wintertime, you can just step on it a lot of times and it'll snap right off like that. But we haven't had a super hard freeze, so it's kind of still halfway growing. So then you can just come in and you cut that down at the ground, right down to the ground, every stem. And then that comes back from the base of the plant, the crown of the plant. And you can weed while you're pruning. Sometimes they just snap off when you're pulling on them. So that's it. Just clean all that up, get off that old debris. And as soon as it quits freezing, they're gonna be right back up. Okay. The next plant I want to show you is May night salvia, Salvia nemorosa, Salvia superba, a couple botanical names. There are other varieties in this line like Snow Hill, Blue Hill, East Friesland, May night, April night. So any of those in that category. So you can see how we have all these spent frozen blooms up at the top. So you just take your hand pruners and come down to the base of the plant, right at the crown of the plant. A lot of times you'll see new growth coming already down at that base. So you just go down there and cut them all off right down at the ground. And my tip on this perennial is you can come in the growing season, and if you have some blooms still going and you have some spent blooms, you can come in here and snip off spent blooms here and there. Or the way I do it is when I have more spent blooms than current blooms, I just chop the whole thing to the ground again. So that way it sends up all even new growth and will just bloom profusely again. The next plant I want to show you is Purple Heart. This is a variety called Pale Puma Purple Heart, or Tradescantia, or Sutcretia pallida, I believe is the botanical name. So on this plant, sometimes you can just come in there and break it off with your hand like that. You don't have to be neat about it because it's just going to send up all new growth and cover all that, but just snap off those old stems down to the ground, or you can come in there and cut them. They really snap off easily. And the cool thing about this plant is you can, during the growing season, you can just take the cuttings and stick them in the ground. As long as you have a couple leaf nodes underground, you got new plants, and free is good. Again, this one usually, when we have a hard freeze, it will freeze all of the stems, and there's no mistaking what you need to remove. But since we haven't had a sustained freeze this winter, there's still some green growth on it, but I still would cut it down to the ground every February to get it ready for all new spring growth. So just rake through the old stems there, get all the debris off, pull a weed or two. So there you go with that. And you can see how hard, this is that May night, you can see how hard I cut that all the way down to the ground. So, but that will send up all new growth as soon as it's done freezing. The next plant I want to show you is catmint, or nepeta. This is a variety here is Walker's Low, and it will grow, as you can see, about 4 feet wide. It only grows about 2 feet tall, but very wide. This is a plant I like to use instead of lavender because it gives you that same look. But anyway, so you come in here, and even though it's grown 4 feet wide, you're going to cut it back down to 6 inches, or really kind of to the ground. Just cut back down to, you'll see a rosette of growth at the base. So hopefully when I cut this back, you'll be able to see that. So I'm just going to come in here and start cutting. Yes, I can see that new growth down at the bottom. Oh, and it smells good when you're doing it too. It's so fragrant. The foliage is so fragrant. Try to keep your fingers out of the way when you're snipping. Not that I would know anything about that. So, I don't know, can you see right here at the base how we have that new fresh growth coming out right there? See that? And down here at the base of the plant, all new fresh growth that will start growing as soon as we're done with freezes. And again, we'll fill back out to that 4-foot lavender blooming perennial. So there you go on that one. The next one we're going to tackle is, this is Palace Castle Artemisia. Excellent, excellent, fragrant foliage plant, but it grows very large, 4 to 5 feet wide. This is that Palace Castle Artemisia. You can see how wide and sprawling this is, but we are going to cut this back down way down at the base of the plant as well. And you may need your loppers to do that because some of the stems on this are very large. So you're thinking, where do I start? Just start chopping away and you will get to where you need to. So just come in here and start cutting those big stems away. So you can see some of the stems I'm cutting are quite large. They do cut very easily though because they're a softer wood. I mean, look at the size of that stem that got cut. Don't be afraid to cut that. Yes. We do this every year. And yes, it leaves a lot of space around the plant. But what I do then, in fact, hopefully you can see this, is I like to plant daffodil bulbs underneath these plants, because when they're cut back in February, then there's room for the daffodils to come up and do their show. And then when they're starting to fade away, then the perennials will be growing up and covering them up. So you kind of get that great tag team effect. So somewhere between, 6 inches to a foot is where you're going to cut this back. And then again, that will just, all those fresh cuts will start pushing new growth from the base of the plant. And again, it will be 4 or 5 feet wide. The next perennial is Zexmania. Love this plant. It is so drought tolerant, so heat loving. Where it's placed right now is southwest exposure, and it just blooms its head off all summer. But it does go completely dormant back down to the crown. So all of the old growth gets cut off. I don't mind leaving this through the winter in case there's birds that want to come and forage off the seed heads of this. But you just come in here. You can use shears or you can use hand pruners. Sometimes when you're pruning, you might get some new baby plants. So you can pull those out and plant them somewhere else. Cut them back, plant them, and see if you can get a new free plant. Also, I don't know if you can see right here, this is another plant that I like to underplant with daffodils because it's cut back in February. The daffodils come up, bloom in March, and then the perennial Zexmania is starting to grow back. It will cover that up. You can let the daffodil foliage fade naturally. Okay. This is Salvia gregia. We've already demonstrated that over there. Ready. This perennial right here is Snow Hill Salvia. It's in the same family, the Salvia nemorosa, as the May Night. It gets cut exactly the same. You can see the clump of the crown right there, and then this is all the old growth. So I'm just going to take my shears and just chop that off. And just get right down to that crown. And again, there's I think 3 or 4 of them in here. I'll cut all those down, get all that debris out of there, and they will all send up new growth when it's done freezing and bloom white spike-like blooms all summer long. This perennial here. Let me clean this debris away. This is pink skullcap. So it stays fairly evergreen, but what I like to do with it in this time of year is just give it what I call a haircut, just to kind of tidy it up and get off any of the little ends that maybe had a little damage. There are some years when we've had sustained temps maybe in the 20s that it will freeze deeper in and you can cut it off at the ground. But this year when it's been so mild, I just give it a haircut. So literally just come in with the shears, give it a haircut to kind of cut off any of the tips that have had a little freeze damage on them and just tidy it up. You can see some of the pink blooms on it right here. It will bloom profusely pink all summer long. There. Just a little tidy up. Okay, next I want to show you lamb's ear. This is a variety called Helen von Stein. It does not bloom. It's also called big ear lamb's ear. The other one is little ear. It spreads more, it blooms, and I'm not crazy about the bloom, so I prefer this variety. It just stays tidier. So, but that's not very tidy. So what we do in the springtime is you come in here and you can just take it with your hand and pull away any of the brown crispy growth, and it smells really good too. But you can see down at the base of the plant, you see all that new fresh growth coming. So you just want to come in, if there's any thicker old stems that you want to cut off, you can do that, like here, if I can get in there. So you can just get that old woody stem off of there. You can actually plant that. These will root and give you some free plants. But don't be afraid to cut this back hard. Just go in there and clean it out and get down to that nice, clean, fresh growth that's coming. And you may have to do this a couple times during the growing season. I know, like in the summertime, it will have some brown growth on it. Browning. So you just cut that off, or you can just pull it off in the summertime. Just come in there and clean it up with your hand. So it doesn't look overly lovely right this minute, but I know that all of this growth at the bottom will be growing and flushing out as soon as the growing season is upon us, and it will look awesome after that. So there. Ready? Okay, the next perennial I'm going to show you, it's called four-nerve daisy. Hymenopsis, I think is the botanical name. So this one here, you can see how this one over here, I hope you can see, is mostly in bloom. This one here is mostly spent blooms. So what I do is when I have more spent blooms than blooming, even though there's still a little bit of color on it, I just give the whole thing a haircut. So this one is evergreen. The foliage will stay evergreen on it. So I just take these little hairy like stems and cut them down to the foliage of the plant. And then what I like to do is take these stems like this and just tap them on the ground, or go like that and scatter those seeds, because a lot of times they will reseed, and free is good. So yeah, I just come in and cut those off, tidy it up. So you can see a few little blooms coming right down in here. There's a little one starting, and there's one, but that will have a bigger flush of growth. This is an amazing little perennial. I mean, it's January and it's blooming. So it will bloom almost 12 months out of the year, especially on a mild winter. I'm going to show you a couple varieties of sedum. This particular variety is called, and there will be a test, Sedum capshaticum. So this still looks fairly good, but again, it's got some spent blooms, it's got some damage, so it just gets cut down to the ground. Usually our freezes are enough to knock the whole plant back down, and there's no mistaking what you need to cut. So I just cut back to the crown of the plant, and it will send up all new growth again. So you can kind of see down here the little rosettes forming at the base. That will come back and form the new plant, and it will just be nice and clean and tidy. But the cool thing about this plant, again, take any of these stems, stick them in the ground, and as long as you got a little leaf node underground, you got free plants. And then this particular variety is called Sedum reflexum. Maybe blue spruce sedum or something like that. This one here is evergreen. There's really nothing you need to do with this plant. It does send up a little yellow bloom on it. As a matter of fact, give me 1 second and I will show you what the bloom looks like. So it will send up these little bloom spikes like this. When they're done blooming and they're spent and kind of crispy on the end, you can cut those off down at the base and toss those away. So that'll just make it a little tidier for you. But you know, enjoy the blooms and let the bees enjoy those blooms. But other than that, it just has kind of this carpet of gray, green foliage. Oh, and here's another sedum right here. This one is called Sedum potassium. Oh, and also again, with any sedum, if you stick it in the ground, it will root and grow. So this is Sedum potassium, and again, it has that just little low growing greenish gray growth, and I love to plant it around rocks. It just kind of hugs in around the rocks, but you do nothing to it. It does bloom a little white bloom a little bit later in the season, and when it's done blooming, you can cut those off or not. They'll just kind of fade back into the plant. So this here is called Millennium Allium. If I had my shears, this one here just cut off at the ground, and it will send up all new growth again. Again, we haven't had a hard enough freeze to really knock these back, but it blooms later in the season, so I want all new growth on this instead of a mixture of the old and the new. You will have the same look as this with garlic chives. Garlic chives bloom here in the fall, like September timeframe. And same thing, even if they have any green on them right now, just cut them down in the ground and get all new fresh growth. And when they're blooming, take a taste of those little white blooms. Oh my goodness, they are so spicy, garlicky flavored. They're just amazing. Now I want to talk about this perennial called Henry Dulberg Salvia. It's a Salvia farinaceae. There's other varieties of it, but this variety will grow about 3 feet tall and get big, long blue spike blooms on it. So here's the pruning technique to this plant. Take your shears, chop it off at the ground. So I don't know if you can see it, but there's new growth coming right here at the bottom. So, but one thing I want to point out about this plant is that is the pruning technique for a couple times more through the season. So this plant will start coming up in March, and by April it will be blooming. It will bloom all of April, all of May, and then it starts looking what I call leggy, where the bottom foliage seems to die away, and then you just have top growth. So I call that leggy. Just grab your shears, chop it to the ground, And within a few weeks, it will be back up and blooming again. So don't be afraid to cut this plant as many times as you need to keep it looking good. So again, you'll do it in February, you'll probably do it again in late May, early June, and then you'll probably do it again maybe late August, early September to get it ready for that fall flush of blooms. So same technique every time, just chop it to the ground. All right, now I'm going to talk about pruning Mexican bush sage, or Salvia leucantha. So this is a fall bloomer, gets these purple velvety like blooms on it and attracts butterflies like nothing else. So it doesn't come back from here, it comes back from the crown. So what you do is grab your pruners and you just come down to the ground and you cut. They're quite large stems, but you come down there and you cut all that growth off, old growth. One thing I wanted to point out, when you're pruning, sometimes you're going to see wasps that have formed nests within your plant. So just approach them carefully. Make sure you don't have any live wasps on it while you're pruning. This time of year that you shouldn't have live ones, but they love to nestle down in the Salvia gregii, and they'll get you. When you get down to the smaller stems, then you can just take your hedge trim or your shears and just come in then and chop it down to the ground. And clear all that away. So then that will be sending up all new growth. And that's a dried up one, but you'll get those beautiful velvety purple blooms in the fall. Okay, now I want to show you a holly fern. Holly ferns are evergreen, but they do sustain some freeze damage here and there. Some winters more than others. So on these mild winters where we haven't had a lot of damage, what I do is I'll just come here and see how we have this brown stem right here. I will come down there and cut that off at the base of the plant and remove that. So I just kind of work my way around and pull back and cut any of those old damaged stems. The one thing that you do need to be careful for, if you do this a little bit too late, February is a great time to do it. If you do it a little bit too late, like into March, what you need to watch for at the base of the plant are the little fiddleheads coming up, because you've got to be careful that you don't cut those. Now, some years, if we've had, again, that sustained cold in the 20s for days, and we get that once in a while, you will have more look like this than you will this. And all I do with that is I take my shears, I come in, I just chop the whole thing to the ground, and then it will send up new growth. I've also had it happen where I have cut the whole thing down, all the little fiddleheads are coming up, and we get that random late freeze and it burns all those fiddleheads to the ground again. Fear not, the plant will come back. If they're tough, they will come back. On these mild winters, it's a little tedious. So I just come in and snip and tidy it up, and it's already got some new growth coming right here. So that's kind of fun. Now on wood ferns that are deciduous, they will turn brown with their first freeze, and you just cut those to the ground to get those cleaned up. Now I'm going to show liriope. This is variegated liriope, and It doesn't have a lot of damage on it, but you can see, for instance, on this stem right here, it's kind of got some tip burn on it, and that could be either from last summer, if it got a little too dry, or maybe with the freeze. And here's a little damage on that one right there, if you can see that. So the way to handle all liriope is, you can do it with your hand shears, pruners, or shears. And what I do is just come in here. Well, that's not gonna work. I'll do this. Just come in here and cut it to the ground. That way you have all new fresh growth in the springtime. And the key to this plant is make sure you get it pruned before the new growth comes, because if you wait and accidentally cut that, what happens is, pretend this is a little new growth that's coming, you accidentally cut that off. This is what the edge of your liriope is going to look like all year. It's all going to be flat topped. So you want that pointed end. So earlier is better. It doesn't matter whether it's the green ground cover type or this variegated type, cut them to the ground, and that gets rid of any spent blooms, any tattered edges, and it's nice, new, fresh, clean growth. So if you have the green ground cover type, you can actually take a weed eater to it and just buzz it all down to the ground. Doesn't have to be pretty or even uniform, just it will all grow back up and cover any of that tattered cutting and be great. And it's just once a year. Is tropical giant spider lily, Hymenocallis spider lily. It's different from Lycoris spider lily, but anyway, it's kind of like a crinum, only better. So you can see this has sustained a lot of freeze damage. So what we're going to do is cut this down to the ground. And these work great for doing that because these stems down at the ground are going to be full of a lot of moisture, kind of like a canna. They're going to be very mushy down at the bottom. So just go in and cut them down. If you have an elephant ear, it will be the same principle. They're probably a pile of mush right now. You can just go in and cut those thick stems down. And I'm not sure if I've mentioned this before, but they say that working in your yard will burn about 300 calories an hour. So if you need to get rid of some Christmas treats, this will do it. Way better than the gym. But you can see the size of those stems. These are great to throw in the compost pile because they're so wet. They really will break down great in your compost. Just keep working your way through the clump. I will say if you use drip irrigation, be careful that you don't have any tubes running through that you accidentally slice through. Clean all your debris away, and then it will stand up all new growth when it's done freezing and the time is right. There you go. everybody? All right, I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, just quickly, I want to go over, review a few things, and then I can, I did answer some of the questions in chat, but I can go back and answer any more after this. So the last program, we talked about this late winter, mid-February pruning of most shrubs, perennials, ornamental grasses, and then the late spring. But this fall, mid-November is the time when you can prune other perennials. So my rule of thumb is if there's a perennial that still looks okay through the winter, like Salvia greggii, fall aster, those things, I kind of leave them. If they have any seed heads that might have a wildlife benefit, I will leave those for the winter, and I will cut them in February. But if something like Purple Heart has just been reduced to mush, I'll go ahead and cut that right after the freeze. So it's kind of, you just kind of have to learn your perennials and see what your tolerance is for, a frozen look. Some people don't even like to leave, black-eyed Susans or coneflowers up because they want that neat and tidy look. But there are seed heads on there, so, if you want to leave those for the birds. Okay, so this is the area that I was showing the beginning of the video when we were pruning perennials. So this is at my church garden. So this was after the pruning had been completed. So everything's cut down, and you can see some of the things are in our evergreen in there. You could see that there's some daffodils blooming in there. So this was probably taken about March timeframe this year. So this is after the historic freeze that we had. So you can see that, I'm going to show you a progression of that. So this was probably taken in April of this year. So you can see how all of these perennials responded to that freeze. Just didn't even bother them. So again, the pink bloomers on the left-hand side there, those are Salvia greggii. They were chopped down to 6 inches tall. That's catmint, the purple lavender right in the middle. That was cut down to the ground off on the right-hand side, up kind of by the steps right there. The white blooming, and then down in the lower right-hand side there, the blue blooming. Those are the Salvia nemorosa or Salvia superba. So snow hill salvia, May night salvia, April night salvia. So those were all cut to the ground, but you can see how they've come back. In the bottom center, that is Bath pink dianthus. It's a perennial dianthus. So that's an evergreen. I'll show a picture of that later on some of the evergreens that really don't need any pruning until after they're done blooming. You can see the yellow blooming right beside that dianthus in the lower center there, and then off to the lower left-hand side. That's the sedum reflexum, and that's that yellow bloom that I was talking about. So you can go ahead and deadhead those when they're done blooming, but they are an evergreen perennial. And this is the same garden in the fall. So you can just kind of see the progression of those perennials. You can see that Purple Heart right there in the middle. I mean, it was just a pile of mush when I pruned it, and it just grew back great. You can see the Katie's Ruellia right there above the boulders right there. So that's the one I stomp on in the wintertime. Just another view of that. Okay, so here's a list. I don't know if you can take a screenshot of this, but these are a lot of the perennials that I use when I do landscaping. So this is just a list of the herbaceous perennials that after a freeze, you can cut them to the ground then. Again, if there's anything that has seed heads like black-eyed Susans or coneflowers and you want to leave them through the winter, you can. It just, again, depends on your tolerance for frozen things. Now, I have noted with an asterisk there the plants that are fall bloomers as well. So the Mexican bush sage, Salvia leucantha, Mexican mint marigold, Turk's cap, mums, or fall aster. If you will cut those down by half in early July, sometime around July 4th, you will have stronger stems to support their fall blooms, because these plants can grow rather tall. And then when they bloom, the blooms are so heavy that they can flop over. So if you will cut them in July, then they've got time to regrow, and they'll be on stronger stems that way, and you'll actually get more blooms, but they won't be so floppy. Okay. So this is what I had mentioned. These are black-eyed Susans. There's the most common variety we have here is gold sturm. This is the other picture there is triloba. So anyway, if you want to leave these seed heads for the winter and let the birds feed off of those, that's fine. If you want to cut them to the ground, that's fine. So after the freeze, you're going to ask, is it dead or is it dormant? And unfortunately, I've had so many people tell me that their landscape crews come in and rip things out because they think they're dead. But you have to learn the difference between dead and dormant. So you've got to learn which plants, what they look like when they're dormant. So anyway, I can't remember if I talked about this last time too, but the hardiness zone that we're in here is 7B, 8A, and some say we're in all 8, not in the 7 anymore. So when you're purchasing perennials, be sure to look for perennials that are in what I call that sweet spot of zone 6 to 9, because you get the cold tolerance on one end and you get the heat tolerance on the other. So annual flowers like pentas, periwinkles, zinnias, coleus, caladiums, sweet potato, they will not survive a freeze because they're only hardy to zone 10. So you know that they are going to die. They're not just going to go dormant, they're going to die. But we also have perennials that are considered marginally hardy. So maybe they're hardy in zone 8B, in 9, like Esperanza is one of those, or yellow bells. So sometimes they will return, sometimes they won't. It just kind of depends on the area that you have them in. If they're in a protected spot, if it's not a historic freeze, a lot of times they will come back even though they are not a zone 8A. So, I usually use those types of plants sparingly because I don't want to take a chance on them. But don't rip them out thinking they're dead. Give them a chance to come back if you're using something that's marginally hardy. But just, look at the plant tag, do Google research, just make sure you look at what that hardiness zone is before you yank them, because they may come back. So here I wanted to show you, you're looking on the zones on your plant tag, that this Picanha rosalita, or it's a cleome, it's a hybrid cleome. It's only hardy to zones 10 and 11. So this plant is going to die. It's not hardy in our zone 8. So you can go ahead and yank it when it freezes because it's not coming back. So hardy perennials will go into dormancy. Again, their tops are going to look like they're dead, but they're just dormant. As soon as the temperatures are right in the spring, they're going to come back again and flourish. So this is, I showed you this plant in the program, the tropical giant spider lily, so it just turns to mush in a hard freeze. And interestingly enough, that video that I did was filmed at the very end of January. I had no idea the hard freeze that we were about to get in February. But anyway, the perennials that I use are all in that zone 6 to 9, so they're hardy and they come back. And the tropical giant spider lily came back with gusto. So leopard plant or farfugium, that's one I didn't address in the video, but this, when it freezes, it's going to be flat as a pancake. Just cut it to the ground. Don't worry about it. It'll come back. It's hardy. I want to mention the seed heads on that. If you will collect those seed heads, because this blooms in November, so if you'll collect those seed heads in probably January and scatter them around in your garden or sprinkle them on some soil in some pots, they will probably germinate for you and you can get free plants. A wood fern, this is one I talked about in the program, but I didn't show you. So that's showing it during the growing season. But when we get a freeze, it's going to turn to a pile of brown, stems. Just cut it completely to the ground. It is dormant at this point and it won't come back until it's warmer in the spring. But like that's one that I will cut back because I don't want to look at that all winter long. So I cut that back right after a freeze. So again, you just kind of look at it and go, do I like the looks of that? Can I tolerate the looks of that through the winter, or do I want to clean it up? And that's when you'll cut it. Cannas, you know, that's how they're going to look right after a freeze. And you just cut them to the ground, and then I just throw some leaves on them, kind of mulch them for the winter. Now you can, I mentioned this in one of the chat answers, if you want to watch the forecast, and if we have a freeze in the forecast, you can go ahead and cut your cannas before that because your stems will be easier to cut. If you wait till after a freeze, they are mushy and wet, and it's just kind of messy to do the pruning then. But you know, if they forecast a freeze and they miss it, then you're cutting your cannas too early, so you could be enjoying them for a few more weeks if they really don't freeze. So I'll let you decide if you want to do it based on a forecast or not. Turk's cap, this is going to it's going to look like that after a freeze. So, there's some little seed heads on that. Again, if you want to leave those for the birds, you can. If you can't tolerate that look, go ahead and cut them to the ground. And one of my little tips on Turk's cap is, because this is a native and this roots very, very strongly. So what happens is it'll send out long stems, and those stems can just lay on the ground, and where they lay and touch on the ground, it's called layering, they will actually root into the ground. So when I am pruning this back after a freeze, I will take those stems that have laid down on the ground and rooted, I will rip them up and pull them back to the main plant and cut them off at the main plant. Because if you don't do that, all those little rooted areas will form brand new plants. And the next thing you know, you have a thicket of Turk's cap. So, it's a native, it's a hummingbird attractor, it's an awesome plant. But if you don't want this to just keep rooting and expanding, just be sure to rip up those rooted stems as they, have laid on the ground and pull it back to the main plant, and you'll keep it in bounds that way. And you will go ahead and cut this plant down to the ground because it comes back from the ground. And it's huge. It's all of 4 feet tall and wide. It's a very, very large, tough perennial. Okay, Salvia greggii, I mentioned this way in the very beginning. I think this is the first one that I pruned. And so you can see how I pruned it way down to the ground, and then this showing how it looks when the new growth is coming in the springtime up there in the upper left. And that is how it will bloom for you if you will do that hard prune. I love this plant. And during the growing season, you can give it a little haircut. If you have more spent blooms than current blooms, just go ahead and take your shears and give it a little 2 to 3 inch haircut, and it will continue blooming for you. Yeah, that picture there. That's a lot of spent blooms, but it's still during the growing season, so you can just go ahead and give that a haircut, and then it'll continue blooming for you. This is Henry Dulberg salvia. I talked about that, the Salvia farinacea. This is what I call leggy, where you've got all those stems showing at the bottom, and you've got the tufts at the top. So I just chop it to the ground because I don't like that look. I chop it to the ground, and within a few weeks, you've got brand new growth coming up, and it'll start blooming again. And you can do that anytime during the growing season. You don't have to put up with that ugly leggy look. Chop it off, and it'll come back. This is that Katie's Ruellia that I stomp on to prune, or you can cut it as well. I do like to grow oxblood lily bulbs underneath Katie's Ruellia because the oxblood lilies come up and bloom above the Katie's. And then the oxblood sends up its foliage after it blooms, and the Katie's goes dormant. So you can have something growing in this area year round. I hope that makes sense. So you'll have the foliage of the oxblood for the winter, and then when the Katie starts growing back in the spring, then the foliage of the oxblood goes dormant. So they just kind of trade space. There you go. Stomp on it and kick it away. I talked about the Powys Castle Artemisia, how you cut that way down to the ground, down to 6 inches. It's an enormous plant. And it's evergreen, so you're going to think, well, it's still got foliage. Why do I have to cut this back? But if you don't cut this back down to 6 inches, it gets very woody, very rangy. It just starts to look very scraggly. So just cut it back hard every February, and it will perform very well for you, but give it plenty of room. Lamb's ear, I talked about that in the program. You're going to get all that brown, leaves on there, and you'll do this a few times a year. You just kind of get in there and clean it up with your hands. Just go through and rake out and yank out all that brown, crispy, papery, old growth and clean it up. It's going to look a little mangled when you first do it, but a couple weeks, it'll be great. Okay, cast iron. I did not talk about that in the program, but this is an evergreen shade perennial. On a normal year, it will get some brown tattered growth like that. So you can cut any of those tattered leaves to the ground. It is very slow to return. Some years, like this year, February, it took a beating, and everybody's just turned, completely brown. I just cut mine completely to the ground, just like that. And it's very slow to return. It will be May before it returns. So this is one, I don't like to cover plants, but this is one that you may want to consider covering in the wintertime if you don't want to take a chance on having to cut the whole thing back. But it came back. Mine came back just fine, but it took till May for it to come back. So know that. There you go. Looks awesome. Holly ferns, I addressed that in the program. Again, some years, we have a few brown fronds on it. Sometimes you cut the whole thing to the ground. Just depends on the year, but it'll come back. Oh, and also I just wanted to point out, when you're cutting, if you see these little dots on the backs of your holly fern leaves, don't worry. It's not a disease. It's not an insect. Those are fern spores. But we just don't have the right conditions for those spores to germinate and form new plants. It takes a very humid, warm climate for that to happen. So, and I mentioned this, be sure to look for those little fiddleheads coming up and don't cut those while you're doing that trimming. Rosemary, you will prune it by 1/3 every May and September, again, to keep it from getting woody and splitting. If you've waited too long to prune it and there's some brown growth down toward the bottom, don't cut down to that brown. Don't treat this like a Salvia gregii where you cut it way low, because it won't come back. You always have to have green below where you're cutting or your rosemary will die. And maybe a lot of you lost your rosemary in this freeze, because it can take a freeze, but not last February, mostly. Okay. This pink skullcap, I showed you that in the program, where some years you just want to give it a haircut, but it's an evergreen, so it really doesn't need a lot of pruning. You can just give it a haircut if you want to tidy it up. There have been maybe 1 or 2 years in the 20 years I've grown this plant that I've had to cut it to the ground, but it will come back. This is Bath's pink dianthus. I showed you that in one of the first slides. And again, the foliage is evergreen. It will bloom in March. And then after it's done blooming, you just take your shears and cut off the bloom stems, but you don't cut the foliage of this plant. It's evergreen, and that in the lower right-hand picture there, that's what the foliage looks like when it's not in bloom. It's just a really soft, grayish, mounding perennial. Don't give it too much water. Doesn't like it. Four-nerve daisy, I talked about that. Again, the foliage is evergreen, but it will send up the little bloom stems, and you just cut off the blooms. And then I like to shake the seeds back into the flower bed. I mentioned that in the video. Lenten rose. This is a winter blooming perennial, and it's evergreen. And if you grew this plant farther up north, all of the foliage gets cut on it, and then it sends up bloom stems. But down here, since we have milder winters usually, some of the foliage still looks pretty good. So all I do with this plant is in December or so, or before January, because it blooms in January and February, I would just go in and clean up any tattered foliage and cut that back to get ready for the bloom. So you have, the blooms are among pretty foliage and not ratty looking foliage, but it is an evergreen perennial. So it does not die back down to the ground. And then you can cut the bloom stalks when they're done blooming. This is just a variety that I really like. Anything in the frost-kissed line has that variegated foliage, so you have pretty foliage even when it's not in bloom. And then what I like to do is, because I really don't like being in my yard when it's 30 degrees, I go out and cut the blooms of the hellebores or Lenten rose. I cut them and I float them in a bowl of water so I can enjoy them in my warm house. Anyway, red yucca could be put in the shrub category that I should have talked about last week, or you can put it in the perennial category, but this is the closest plant to furniture you can put in your yard, because all it needs is when it is done blooming, you cut the bloom stalks. That is it. You do not cut the foliage to this plant ever. So it's tough. Carolyn, you probably grow this in New Mexico. It probably does great there too. It loves hot and dry. So yeah. And then bulbs, I talked about growing those underneath deciduous perennials so that when you have your perennials cut back, then the daffodils can grow up and bloom in the March time frame. And by the time your perennials are growing back, once it warms up in April and May, then the foliage of the daffodils can be covered up and just wither away naturally. But if you have them in an area where you don't have something that's going to cover them up, you have to allow that foliage 6 to 8 weeks after blooming to fade naturally before you cut it, because that foliage is what is storing energy in that bulb to bloom the following year. So you gotta wait on it. Gotta let it go through that ugly period. I just mentioned this where I grow daffodils underneath plants like lantana or zexmania or Turk's cap, because I know they're going to be cut back after a freeze, and then I can grow the daffodils underneath of them. Ground covers, just real quickly on that. Liriope, I showed you that in the video. Again, be sure that you cut it before new growth, and you can take a weed eater to it. You can take hand pruners, whatever. This big blue liriope on the right-hand side along that retaining wall, literally we take a weed eater to it and just buzz it down, and then I rake it out and it comes back great. This is what I want to show you. That new growth emerges with that little pointy tip on it. So if you cut that off, it only grows once a year. So you're going to cut that pointy tip off and you're going to have flat-topped liriope for a year. So be sure to cut it in February because it's usually emerging in early March. And Asian jasmine or purple winter creeper, if you can get in there with a mower and you can set your mower on the highest setting, you can get in there and buzz it down with a mower. You can take a weed eater to it and just cut it down to 3 to 4 inches, and it cleans up all that frozen foliage, and then it will send up all new growth off the ground cover stems, whether it's purple winter creeper or Asian jasmine. And then the last two little ground covers, horse herb is deciduous, so it dies back down to the ground, so you can just cut those little stems off after a freeze. Frog fruit is actually evergreen, but if you want to tidy it up, you can cut it back as well and have it emerge. But they're both native, really, really tough little ground covers. And then just because you're going to be doing all your pruning and cleanup and all that, be sure to mow your leaves or rake them off your lawn. But I go ahead and leave leaves in my beds to just kind of get a little extra protection around perennials for the winter, just to protect the crown of them. You don't have to. You can mulch it if you want, super tidy, but I just leave them in there for the winter and deal with them in the spring. Throw them in my compost pile. So this is my perennial garden in my front yard in the growing season when everything's happy, but this is how it looks in February after I get everything cut back. And you can see some daffodils have been emerging there, and you can see some of the evergreen, plants. You can see ornamental grasses that have been cut back. Anyway, that's just how it looks after you get a prune, and then it goes back to that every year. It's awesome. Love perennials. So again, here's just some information from my blog spot. I do a newsletter on that, and I talk about when it is time to prune these things. The key is you have to know what the perennial is. I mean, if I tell you to go out and prune your salvia greggii and you go, I don't even know what a salvia greggii is, that makes it a little tricky. So you're going to have to learn what the perennials are. So when you see a list, you're going to know what and it describes how to prune it, you're going to have to know what the perennial is. Or you can go to Aggie Hort. Obviously, you know, Texas A&M research information on there, lots of great information for anything landscaping wise or horticulture. That's your source. And again, I talked about this in the video last week, just some of the tools that I like to use. I like to use Felco pruners, hand pruners, but Fiskars is another brand that I really like. And the shears that I used in the video were Fiskars, but you know, whatever you like to use, just keep them sharp. This is the Easy Lap diamond sharpeners that I showed how to use those in the original video last week. And so you can get them on Amazon and just really easy to use. And this is my contact information, my blog, and I'm on Instagram and Facebook too. So you're welcome to send me a message on there if you have a question about something, or you can email me at signaturegardens@verizon.net. So there's that email right there.